this is a early meeting tonight. We're going to do some ethics and government training, and I'm going to invite up Ms. Deborah Moreau to lead us through this training tonight. And then after this meeting, we'll close this and then open our regular meeting. So thank you again for being willing to do this and walking us through this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. For those of you who don't know, my name is Deborah Moreau. I am counsel to the State Public Integrity Commission. We have jurisdiction over all the state employees as well as town and county and municipal employees, as if that jurisdiction does not have their own code of conduct, and in your case you don't. The only ones that do, there's only about 11, Wilmington, Newcastle County, Dover, Lewis has their own, and a few more upstate. What I will say is, when you have your own ethics board, which you can do if you want to, it's a little hard when your town is small. And I can't say Seaford is really small because I haven't been down here for a real long time. I came down today and I'm just blown away with how developed and how big it's gotten. So you would know better than I whether your town, has enough people in it, in the pool, to kind of dilute that, that feeling of these are my neighbors, these are my friends. But I'm happy to come down here and do the training for all of you. If you have any questions as I go along, please just speak out. There's no formal rules or anything like that. So why do you care about ethics in government? Because the people who put you in your council seats care about ethics in government. There's an old Japanese proverb that says the reputation of 1,000 years can be determined by the conduct of 1 hour. And what that means is, if you are a public servant for 30, 40 years, if you do something that's going to be in the paper right before you leave, that will be what you're remembered for. A reputation is something that you should guard zealously, because if something happens to your reputation, it's very hard to rehabilitate that and get that back. So that's why, your reputation is something that you create, and you have to guard it. So what examples can we point to in Delaware of, improper conduct? In the city of Wilmington, and like I said, city of Wilmington has their own ethics department. The council president, who had been on the city council for, I think, 30, 40 years, what they would do every year is they would do the budget, and they would take a lump sum, they would divide it up amongst the council people, and they would say, here is your money for the year, take it to your district, do something that you think your citizens would enjoy. So this gentleman, Mr. Gregory, would decide what he wanted to do in his district, and then he would open a nonprofit that would provide that service. And as an owner of a nonprofit, you can pay yourself administrative expenses, so he would take half the money and put it in his pocket for administrative expenses, and then pass the other half on to the community. He was tried and convicted of using his office for personal gain, and he was just sentenced this past February. He did receive, I believe, a probationary sentence, but he is appealing it. I think his position on appeal is, because he owned a nonprofit, that he could not have personally gained from what he did. And we hear that a lot from people who have nonprofits. Nonprofit is a tax status, that's all it is. It doesn't mean that there can't be conflicts of interest involved with a nonprofit organization. Here's just a quick screenshot of our website. There's a lot of information on there, and you can see at the bottom where it says Code of Conduct. If you click on that, you can find every opinion. It's been updated for 2021. You can find every opinion the Commission's issued for the last 30 years. It's not the entire opinion, it's just enough to kind of give you an idea of what it was about and the facts and what the decision was. And then that way, if you have a question about something that's going on, you could go there and look by topic. You can look at conflicts of interest, accepting gifts, things like that, and you can look and see, what factors the Commission focuses on when they're deciding those things. So why does the legislature tell us what their purpose is when they write a law? Because they cannot write a law that will account for every possible situation that may arise, They can't write a law that says if a vendor gives you takes you to dinner, these are the things you need to do. So they write it generally, and then they expect when you're applying the facts to the law that you think about this, that this is what they're trying to accomplish. They want to ensure public respect and confidence by setting standards of conduct for government personnel, but they don't want to make government employment so terrible that nobody would ever want to do it. So there's a balancing act there between the government's interests and the employee's interests. So the conflict of interest provision is one of the most commonly violated provisions of the Code of Conduct. It says that you can't have a personal or a private interest that tends to impair your judgment. It doesn't have to actually impair your judgment. It only has to tend to impair your judgment. And as a matter of law, if you're handling something, comes across your desk that is related to a relative of yours or a business owned by a relative of yours, you have a conflict of interest. Therefore, you should not review that matter. You should just take it and pass it to someone else and say, this concerns my relative, I can't touch this, could you please handle it? Then you excuse yourself from the discussion and the vote. So, oftentimes what we hear from school boards is, well, I'll just sit there because it's very inconvenient for me to get up and everyone will have to move so I can get out. That's not enough. There's no exception for inconvenience. So if you have, something that's related to a family member, please remove yourself from all discussions, all votes, anything related to that matter. If you don't, it will end up costing the city a lot of money. Because let's say you take a vote on something, and because you participated when you shouldn't have, that vote's flawed now, and it could lead to a lawsuit.
So just a couple questions on that. The difference, the words I've heard used before, and tell me if they're appropriate. There's to recuse yourself,
Yeah.
which is removing yourself from the situation, and then there's something, or there's abstaining from the vote, which you can sit there and abstain from the vote. Are those correct terms?
They are correct terms, but we always tell people you have to recuse.
In the case you're talking about where a family member.
Yes.
For the record, should a person that recuses themselves from the vote, should they state why they're recusing themselves?
They don't have to.
Okay.
And that's probably something in your procedures for the city. It may address that, I'm not sure, but you don't have to. The most important thing is that you remove yourself from that decision. And, whether people wonder why you left or not, is nice information to have, but not necessary.
Okay, thank you.
So typically, when we're abstaining from a vote, it's when someone has missed a meeting or, that's about the only time.
It doesn't happen very often.
Right.
So you just sit there because you weren't there for the last meeting?
Correct.
Yeah, that's
So-
fine.
So and most people make that statement, I wasn't here, so I'm going to abstain from voting. So I'm just trying to find out when those terms are used and not used.
So when you have a conflict of interest, you have to recuse. If you missed a meeting, it just means I'm not up on the
Okay.
what information's gone by.
That
So
would
I'm
be
just
abstaining.
Yeah, then you can abstain.
I have a question around the conflict aspect. So, as a sitting council member, we make decisions around increase in utilities, right? We make decisions on increases of service. So all of that impacts each and every one of us, right, as homeowners and business owners. Is there something that kind of governs, or can you define a little bit more in depth about a conflict of interest?
Yes, I will. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an example of a personal interest. This is a Delaware case. The Department of Corrections put out an RFP, a request for proposals. They only got 2 bids. That's because there aren't very many companies that offer health care to prisoners, which is what they were bidding for. So they get 2 bids from Prison Health Systems and ARA. They have a bidding committee, and they get 3 people on the bidding committee. They open the bids, they talk about them, they talk about the pros and cons. They get ready to vote, and Mr. X says, well, you guys go ahead and vote because I can't, because my wife works for ARA. Well, so the other 2 vote. Luckily, they voted the same way, or else they'd have been tied, and they voted to give the contract to ARA. Well, Prison Health Systems knows that the gentleman on the bid review committee has a spouse who works at the prison. Now, she's not the CEO of the company. She's not in contracting. She just provides care to the prisoners. So they filed a lawsuit, and during the case, it comes out that, Mr. X says, well, I was there and I did discuss it with everybody else, but I didn't vote, so we're good. And the court says, no, you're not good, because, you can communicate with people without saying anything, and how can you do that?
Nonverbal communication.
If somebody said, prison health systems, let's give the contract to them, and somebody goes, well, they know, he hasn't said anything, but he has communicated, what he thinks about the issue to everyone. And so that's why you're asked to recuse, so that you can't communicate
Right,
with those.
but I guess my question is more around like the gray area, like there's a filter or system to use saying, hey, you know what? You should recuse yourself, or it falls, you know what I mean? So if you have questions around whether you should or you shouldn't, how do you answer those? Does it make sense? Like if it's a gray area?
If it's something involving a family member, now I'm not talking about let's change the water fees for everybody in the town, because it doesn't affect one person more than it does the other. It's not like you're gonna have a water rate increase, but you're gonna accept everybody from the city council. I mean, that obviously would be a conflict. But just doing those general things that you do on a large scale for citizens, those are not considered interests that you have.
Okay.
To clarify, so the examples you're saying, and you're using the term like leave, means we should physically get up and
Yes.
leave, get out of the room, and let them deliberate, and then come back when it's done.
Right, because for example, in school boards, they often vote on teacher raises. And a person on the school board will have a spouse that's a teacher. Well, they don't, the guy sitting next to them doesn't want to vote no for the raise, because he doesn't know how this guy's going to react. So he votes yes because he's uncomfortable. It's to allow that. It's to allow people who are sort of intimidated that way to, to be free to cast their vote the way they want to.
But if we can go down that path one more time, so what if someone sitting up here has a family member that works for the city of Seaford, and we're voting on raises? Should that person then recuse themselves?
Yes, and I'll tell you why, because this is different than the thing that you mentioned, because this is employee-specific and it's not city-specific.
Right.
Okay?
Makes sense, yep.
And so because you have it's somebody, let's say they're gonna vote for raises and you're a relative, you can't vote on that. And I'll tell you a perfect example of that. We had a council person who had a son who was head of the police department. People were complaining that he was voting on the police budget. And so we had him come in and we asked him, are you? And he said, yeah, but I'm voting on it in the big picture of things. But it didn't really solve the problem that his son is the head of the police department. So the commission said, why don't you ask your solicitor, can you take the budget and break it out into pieces by department, or however they wanted to do it, and accept the police budget out, so that he would have an opportunity to recuse himself for that piece of it. Because, when the commission said to him, is it possible you can't vote on the budget? And he was like, that's kind of the biggest thing we do all year, and I would feel uncomfortable, not participating. So they came up with a way, for him to still participate, but to keep everything clean as well.
So just for our processing, if an issue comes up or a topic that one of us needs to recuse ourselves, we should say it publicly and say, Mr. Mayor, I want to recuse myself of this topic, and then leave, and then carry on.
Well, and I think what we've learned here from this little study is you ought to recuse yourself at the very beginning,
Yeah.
not after the discussion, and then say, hey, by the
That-
way, my son works for this department,
Yeah.
I better step out.
That's what I'm saying, but I think you still publicly want to say it, so it's on the record, so why you're just
Right.
not just leaving and not voting on it.
Right, I agree.
It would cut down on confusion if people are wondering, if you say, well, I'm just gonna recuse myself, and they're like, why did he leave?
Yeah, right, yep. Good
Okay,
point.
so here's another case with Department of Corrections. Here's a hiring decision that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, which, nobody ever thought it would. There's a job for Department of Corrections that's getting ready to be posted, and it's a very sought-after job because it's in the motor pool. People in the motor pool can move around, they're not locked in all day, so when those jobs come available, people really, really, apply for them. So they post a job, and they get a hiring committee together, and they have Mr. Mason, Mr. Cristiano, and Miss David. Mr. Cristiano is the Deputy Commissioner of Department of Corrections, so he's number 2. Mr. Mason is head of the motor pool, so we're not surprised he's on that employee review committee because they would be working for him. And then we have Miss David, who's an administrative person who stepped in to fill out the panel. So Mr. Mason says, I'll tell you what, why don't we have an aptitude test and, we'll see how much these people know about mechanics. So he makes up an aptitude test. This is like 40 years ago. So he gave it to his secretary to actually type, like in the office to type. So she types it up. They get ready to have the interviews, and they're going to test the applicants. And they have a bunch of applicants. But we're going to talk about Mr. Coleman. Mr. Coleman's a casual, seasonal, part-time employee, and he works in the motor pool. He's a runner. So if Mr. Mason says go get something, he runs and gets it. Mr. Mason likes him enough that in the office he refers to him as son. Mr. Cristiano, or Mr. Sestito applies for the job. Mr. Sestito is Mr. Cristiano's nephew. Okay, so the number 2 guy at DOC, his nephew's applying for the job. And then you have Mr. Bryce. Mr. Bryce is already a corrections officer, and he has motor pool experience from his time in the military. So during the test, Mr. Coleman got 7 right. Mr. Bryce got 5, and Mr. Sestito only got 3. So when the state posts a job and there's this application process, it takes a while for the job to get filled. While all this is going on, and this is a true Delaware story because it could only really happen here, Mrs. Bryce is in Walmart, and she sees Mrs. Cristiano, and she says, hey, did you hear they posted that job for the motor pool? She says, yeah, my nephew's getting that job. Yikes, okay. So Mrs. Bryce goes home and says, I just saw Mrs. Cristiano in Walmart. She said her nephew's getting that job. Well, Mr. Bryce waits, and sure enough, when they award the job, Mr. Sestito gets the job. I had a guy in my class once who was there when this happened, and after they had hired Mr. Sestito, they were like, oh, what are we gonna do? We gotta put him somewhere because Mr. Bryce filed a grievance with the Merit Employee Relations Board. He says, look, there's no way that this interview process could have been fair. You got the guy who works for Mr. Mason who calls him son. You got the nephew of another guy. And it comes out, during the grievance process that Mr. Coleman got 7 right because he was dating the woman who typed up the test.
Oh.
So Mr. Bryce says, this isn't fair. And the merit board says, you're right, it's not fair. They repost the position, and he gets it. They give him his back pay. They give him, everything that he has coming to him, and he says, I'm sorry, thank you so much, but could you also please tell Department of Corrections to pay my legal fees? And at the time, the board didn't think they had that power. So he went to Superior Court,
And
which
they
is where
paid
you...
it.
I'm sorry?
I said, and they paid it.
He went to Superior Court, and Superior Court told him the same thing. But Mr. Bryce is a very, he's a smart cookie. And he went to the Supreme Court of Delaware, and the Supreme Court said, yes, pay his legal fees. It's not fair for him to have to pick up the tab on that. So you have a simple job filling, right? And it's in court, it's at the MERB, it's everywhere, and it costs them hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Can I ask a question around that? So when you say family, like, how deep is that? Like, is
Okay,
it?
so if you're related by blood or marriage, that's family.
Okay.
You can also have friends that are considered family members. So remember when I said that the statutory purpose of the legislation, sometimes you have to kind of, piece things together from the facts. So what the commission does is if there is a possible conflict with a friend, they do, ask for additional facts. Well, how well do you know them? How much time do you spend together? Do you go on holidays together? Those kinds of things. So if it's somebody you know well enough to wave at in Walmart, you're not going to have a conflict. And thank goodness, because here in Delaware, then we wouldn't get anything done if that was the standard, right?
Yep.
But if it's somebody that you have at your house and you spend holidays with them and weekends and things, that friend now stands in the status of, you know, you should treat them like a relative even though they're not. So you wouldn't want to be involved in anything, you know, that is related to somebody that you're good friends with
Okay.
either.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Don't represent or assist a private business before, I'm sorry, are you guys a city or a town?
City?
City. So let's say, you know, your cousin wants to get the landscaping contract with the city. And you get up and you come around here and you stand here with him and help him explain and what he's going to do. Obviously, you can't do that. And if he did want to do something like that, you would recuse yourself and remove yourself from the situation. There's a rule about employees leaving and returning as contractors. So if you have city employees, let's say somebody in the accounting department, decides that they want to open their own accounting business, so they quit their job with the city, and then they come back with a proposal to contract with the city to do the exact same thing they were doing as a city employee. They cannot do that for 2 years. In the private sector, they're called non-compete clauses. They are very common, and that's to protect your investment in employees, because you don't want to bring employees in and teach them very specific knowledge that they need to do their job, and then they leave after a year and take your training and put it to use for their own personal benefit. So that's why there's a 2-year restriction. It can't be a never-ending restriction, right? Because people have to earn a living. But you know, you can't come back and do the exact same thing you were doing before. The appearance of impropriety is very hard to define, but if you're doing something and you find yourself thinking to yourself, should I be doing this? The answer is no. Because if you're asking yourself that question, somebody else is asking the question as well. And this is just, you know, a reasonable person, even if they knew all the facts, would think that what you were doing was improper, just because of the visual of it. You cannot be prosecuted on the appearance of impropriety alone, because it's a very, like I said, it's hard to define, and so it's hard for people to, you know, adjust their behavior until somebody points out to them, hey, that doesn't look right, maybe you shouldn't do that. If you know the city is getting ready to annex land or something, or, you know, something the city's gonna do, don't go out and buy an interest in a company that may benefit from it in the long run, thinking, you know, down the road you could maybe, you know, invest in this company and make more money because of their contract with the city. Don't take any gifts, payment of expenses, or anything of monetary value if it may result in your impaired judgment, preferential treatment to any person, official decisions outside official channels, or have an adverse effect on the public's confidence in their government. This is, so gifts. Vendors like to give gifts, you know, at Christmas, holidays, things like that. I did a training for City of Milford. City of Milford has Purdue in their jurisdiction. And they said every year Purdue gets together and gives all the Milford employees a chicken. Could they take it? I said, well, if you don't work here next year, are they going to call you and find you so they can give you your chicken? Or are they giving it to you because of where you work? And I understand a chicken's only, you know, 15, 20 bucks or whatever it is. But it's that appearance that the people who make zoning decisions, the people who make regulatory decisions are taking a gift from that company. So instead, what they did, Purdue still wanted to donate, so they took, Purdue donated and they split them up amongst the council members, and then they go deliver them to needy families in their area, which was a much better solution than what they were doing. Lunches. Vendors like to do lunches. They can do a lunch if it benefits you, but they can't do a lunch if it benefits themselves. Here's an example. a fairly large municipality bought a huge piece of sewer equipment. And it was new, and the technology was pretty new, and once they got it back and they got it up, it kept breaking and they couldn't run it properly. And they had done Zoom with the manufacturer, and they'd done all kinds of things. So the manufacturer invited them to come to the factory and said, why don't you guys come down here, we'll show you from the ground up, how it works, how it's built. So they called and said, can we do this? Well, the commission said yes, because it benefits the municipality that they work for. They have to know how to operate that machine. They have to know how to get the money's worth out of it, right? So they drove down. They could have flown, but they drove. They stayed, at a regular hotel and ate regular, meals. It's not like they had cocktail hours and golf trips and things like that. Got the information they needed, came back, it worked perfectly. Now they need that for safety and all those reasons. But if a vendor wants to give you a lunch so they can give you a sales pitch, no, because that benefits them. We actually had a vendor come in with an agency and say, can I give lunch to to this group, and we'll talk about our new product. And the commission said no. And they said, well, if we don't provide lunch, nobody will come. Well, isn't that a bribe? I mean, that's what it is. You're giving them food in exchange for their lunch hour. I did a training for the group of city governments, the Delaware group of city governments, something like that. And some ladies came up to me afterwards and said, we have a lady in our town who keeps going to like Sam's Club and buying cases of sodas and snacks for our police officers, and we're kind of worried about it. She does it a lot, and we're wondering if this is okay. And I said, well, do they go to her house a lot? Like, is she, a problem person, and she's trying to butter them up? Nope. The little lady lives by herself, very quiet. She just enjoyed doing it. And I said, I don't have a problem with that. She's not a vendor, number one, right? She's a citizen. And she's not a citizen that is trying to set herself up for, a better situation by offering this snacks and things like that. So citizens, it's a different relationship with citizens. If they want to bring in something for the staff or for you, that's fine. As long as they don't have, like a zoning request pending or something like that.
So is there a dollar amount attached to this, or are you just saying don't take anything?
I'll take it.
Nothing?
You could take the things like I gave you, they're called de minimis items.
Well, okay, how is that defined?
I'm not gonna tell you a dollar amount because some people are extremely happy for $5 and some people are not happy with 40. So you can't really kind of put a dollar amount on it.
Okay.
We say lanyards and tchotchkes and, hats, keychains, you can take those. But if they want to come in and give you sweatshirts or a lunch or something like that, then, you shouldn't take them.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I think that's about it. Gifts and lunches. Don't use your office to secure unwarranted privileges, private advancement, or gain. I used to work for the Department of Justice. When I worked there, a lady came from another state agency. She had been with the state for 12 years. And when you work for the Department of Justice, you have to have access to a computer program called Delgis, where you look up people's criminal histories and things like that. You can't do your job without it. So you come in, first day you come in, you sign a piece of paper that says, I will never look up anybody I know in this system. Well, she'd only been there a week, and she was going through a nasty divorce, and her soon-to-be ex-husband had a new girlfriend, and she couldn't resist, and she looked her up and then posted it on Facebook. Well, the next day, she fired herself. She had no job. So compare her motive with a judicial secretary who, if she liked you very well, she would look you up in Delgis and send you a Christmas card. It's the same thing. You can't use city property for your benefit, whether it's a good motive or a bad. And it has to be that rule because who's the judge of what's a good motive, right? Some people might think getting you a Christmas card's a good motive, and some people might not. That's why it has to be, a bright line rule that says, don't do this. There was a guy in Florida who he put in his zip code at work. He worked for their equivalent of Health and Social Services, and found out, or he wrote down all the names of people who are HIV positive in his area, and then, gave it to his friends, as in, do not date this person, they're HIV positive. So, every agency, every municipality has access to kind of confidential information. Who got their water shut off, or their electric shut off last week? Things like that. So you can't use that information for your own gain. And you can't disclose confidential information beyond the scope of your group. So if you all go out for dinner or lunch or something like that, just make sure that whatever you're talking about, you keep your voice low, because somebody behind you, and I know you all know this, knows the person you're talking about. I was in a coffee shop in Dover once, and there were two lawyers in there, and I knew they were from out of state because they were talking about Delaware government. It was the Exelon merger when they were doing that thing. And they were talking about who they knew in state government and how much influence they thought they had. And I knew everybody they were talking about. I knew they weren't from here because nobody from here would talk that loud. So just be very, very careful about that. If you have a question and should I vote on this, should I participate, you can ask for an advisory opinion. If the commission gives you an advisory opinion and you abide by its advice, then you are legally protected from having a complaint filed against you. So there's an incentive for you to do that. We will keep it confidential. We're not going to say Councilman Henderson came in and wanted to ask a question. We're not going to call Councilman McCoy and say, did you know so-and-so called and said this, this, and this? We don't do that. We don't tell anybody that you came in. You can ask for an advisory opinion, and sometimes you might ask for permission to do something you're not allowed to do. Here's an example. Delaware State Police have their aviation unit here in Sussex County. It's in Georgetown. And they have 3 pilots. They employ 3 pilots. If you are a pilot that earns a living being a pilot, you have to be FAA certified. To be FAA certified, you have to have 7 hours training on an aircraft with retractable landing gear. Well, they have an airplane, but it only has fixed landing gear. They don't want to go buy a whole new plane so 3 people can get 7 hours of training apiece, right? So they looked at the local airports, and they went to Salisbury, Cheswold, DSU, Dover Air Force Base, everywhere. And they got prices. And it turned out that the cheapest person, the less expensive person, who was also located in Georgetown, so there's no travel expenses, was the guy who worked for Delaware. There's a little known provision in the Code of Conduct that says, if you're going to give a contract, in our case, a state contract to another state agency, it has to be publicly noticed and bid if it's over $2,000. Our usual bidding threshold's $100,000. So they didn't have time to do the public notice and bidding. Their certification was ready to expire, and they brought in all the documentation. We know that even if we publicly notice and bid it, we're likely not to get a price better than this. Can we please skip the public notice and bidding? Commission said yes. So that's a waiver, and those are not confidential. We publish those so everybody knows that you have permission to do what you're doing. And it says it has to be requested in writing, so back then that was like you would actually write a letter or whatever. You can just email me. Now, complaints. Members of the public cannot ask for advisory opinions or waivers. Only you can do that. But members of the public can file complaints. It has to be sworn, so that means that the person has to sign their name and it has to be notarized. So we don't get as many complaints as you would think because people often don't want to be identified. We'll get a lot of anonymous letters about, hey, so-and-so is doing this thing, but they don't sign it. Well, in that case, I don't have anybody I can go back to, so I would just contact the person it's about. say, hey, nobody filed a complaint, but we're getting this information. Would you like to come in and get an advisory opinion? And usually they will, and that usually solves the issue. But if they follow through with a complaint, the commission will look at it first to make sure it's correct, because, you know, we get a lot of complaints about things we have no jurisdiction over. Judges, for example. We don't have jurisdiction over them, but we get a lot of things from the prison that say, Judge so-and-so's, you know, doing this and that. We're not gonna call the judge and get him all upset about that, because we know we're gonna dismiss it, because we don't have jurisdiction. So there's that review process where the commission makes sure, yes, we have jurisdiction, then you would get a notice and say, hey, so-and-so filed a complaint against you, here's the issue. You know, if you wanna hire a lawyer, you can do that. You can call your own witnesses, bring your own evidence, and if you have a witness that you want to come testify on your behalf, but they don't like you and they don't want to, we'll issue a subpoena for you to make that witness come, because you have to be able to present your case. And if you need that witness, a subpoena will be issued to make them attend. And it's confidential again, unless you're found in violation, then it's made public. Or unless you decide you want it to be public. Let's say somebody files a complaint and it gets out that there's a complaint against you. So, you know, you decide, oh, I'm gonna have this open. I don't have anything to hide. I know that the person's wrong, you know, and I want everybody to know about it. Then you can say, hey, I'd like this to be open so everybody can find out.
Could I ask a question here for clarity? So let's say somebody opened up a claim against me, hypothetically. I bring legal counsel, same scenario that you used earlier in the exercise, the gentleman at the Department of Correction. Could that person be liable for that expense? Could I hold them civilly liable for the expense of me defending myself?
Do you guys have counsel for the city?
We do. We have
I would think
citizens.
they would. If it was related to your city council duties, I think they would represent you.
Okay,
You wouldn't have to get your own
okay,
a lawyer.
all right,
Yeah.
okay, all right, thank you.
But like, let's say, for example, it was one of the employees of the city. They wouldn't have that option, so they would have to get their own lawyer.
Okay.
And that's, you know, sometimes hard to come up with that money in
Sure.
advance, right? Hoping you can be reimbursed later. And then if you are found in violation and you think the commission messed up and you want to appeal it, you can appeal to the Superior Court. And they do what's called a review on the record, and they just read the record. So all the evidence and everything is put into the case in the early part of it, when there's witnesses and all, becomes very important on appeal, because the court will not look outside the record. They won't ask additional questions or anything. It's only what's on the record.
Is that a writ of certiorari is what that is?
No, yes, that is what it is,
Okay.
yep. When they appeal, because actually, we had somebody file a complaint against a lawyer, and the commission decided that based on the allegations, that we didn't have jurisdiction over her because it was alleging that she was improperly practicing law, which is something that's specifically under the Supreme Court. So we said, we're not gonna exercise jurisdiction here, we're gonna let the Supreme Court handle it. And the person who filed the complaint appealed it because they wanted us to prosecute her. And the court found in our favor for that. So, but, you know, they went through the Superior Court process, took us to Supreme Court as well. And it was affirmed on appeal.
May I ask one more question? So if a citizen wants to file a complaint against an elected official, just saying, is there a fee attached to that? So if somebody contacts you and says, hey, I want to levy this complaint against this individual, is there a fee attached for that person to do this?
No,
Okay,
because we don't want to discourage people because
Okay.
they don't have the money in their pocket.
Okay.
So no.
all right, thank you.
But we do, you know, there is a process, like when we do that review process before we contact you, we kind of weed out all the things that are clearly not, you know, applicable or appropriate.
Okay,
So if you have a scenario where council makes a zoning decision, and, you know, our process here is we typically vote based on findings of facts. So we keep it to zoning issues, the building official puts together the findings of facts. Is this a case where being clear that you are voting based on the findings of fact, if you get a complaint against you, can really support your case as an elected official that this is what you made your decision on?
It can, but it won't remove a conflict. So if you had a
Agreed.
conflict to begin with, that's not gonna help you any.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just saying yes really creates a lot of issues for you if you're not careful, if there is any sense of impropriety, I would guess, correct?
Well, and like I said, you can't just have, be found in violation solely on an appearance of impropriety, because it's too tenuous. The courts don't like that. They want to have actual, law and facts and things. So it's pretty rare that you would even be called in for an appearance of impropriety. Usually that's a phone call and say, hey, somebody saw you doing whatever it was, maybe you could do, something different. Here's an example. Guy who worked for DENREC had to go into one of these local communities, I think it was on the coast, like maybe Pickering Beach or somewhere small like that. And he was doing a project there, and the only place to park in the town is in front of a bar. So on day 2, the phone calls start. Hey, did you know there's a guy, your DENREC guy's been drinking in this bar for a day and a half? He wasn't, that was the only place to park, but that's an appearance of impropriety. We're not gonna call him in, for that and say, because it's so clear that what's happening is not wrong.
Understood.
But it's mostly, if I leave you with nothing else, if you have, any direct relationship to a person that you're making a decision about, or a business owned by them, even if it's a nonprofit business, you have to recuse yourself, because that decision you make will be damaged from the get-go. You don't want to undo that and, have to start all over, so. And then the sanctions. The conflict of interest piece of it carries a criminal penalty up to a year in prison and/or a $10,000 fine. There could be administrative penalties, but for elected officials, there's nothing that we can do. We would publish the information, and then the voters would decide at the next election, how they wanted to handle that. But you can't have an executive branch agency undo an election. So, that's why we can't take the people out of their seats. And if it's somebody who's on a board, then the person who has the responsibility of appointing them, do you appoint board members? Then we would let you know and say, hey, we think this person probably shouldn't be on this board anymore.
So if an elected official knowingly violates, your organization would issue that statement that this was wrong, then it would, in essence, be up to the council to censure that person?
Yes.
Up to impeachment if it was egregious enough?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then sometimes, depending on what we find, we turn it over to the Attorney General's office. I just turned one over 2 weeks ago that was, it was just beyond the pale. And so if it's a situation like that where we don't think that the administrative sanctions or the civil sanctions would be enough, we'll turn it over to the Attorney General and let them prosecute for misuse of office or something like that.
Can I ask a question? So as a newly elected official, people coming in and don't know a lot of the do's and don'ts and gray areas, right? And so is there any type of information, I know the city provides a handbook, and that's just kind of an overview. So I know the Supreme Court ruled ignorance isn't an excuse, right? So if you don't know it, that's not an excuse. But, so my question is, does your office provide newly elected individuals with information around the do's and don'ts?
We don't, because that piece I showed you, the code of conduct on our website.
Yes.
That has almost every factual situation that could possibly.
Yeah, but I'm in my
come up.
second term, and this is the first I've heard of it.
I was a lawyer for 9 years and didn't know we had a public integrity commission
Right.
either.
So I'm saying it's important as a newly elected official,
Yeah.
somebody coming in from the private sector that never been in government before in their life. And there's a lot of conflicts and a lot of things that, you just don't know. So that was why I was asking that question. So you could come in and do something really not, per se, it's because of private interest or you're gaining something out of it just because you didn't know. And that's why I was wondering if there's material, that someone can have. Now that we know about this website, that's a great tool, but I'm saying, like I said, I'm in my 4th year. This is the first time I've ever heard of this.
Well, and I'm always open for an invitation to come down. I've been in Sussex the last few weeks coming down and doing the towns down here. But you're right, we have to be better at messaging, for those organizations that we're responsible for that are a little more, spread out from our location. We try the best that we can to get around
Yeah, and I'm not
everybody.
throwing fault or
No, I'm
saying
just-
anything.
you're right.
I'm just saying there's tools out there that could help educate people so they're not making a wrong, doing something they shouldn't do because they didn't know.
Right.
That's the only reason I'm saying, I'm not
No,
throwing
and
fault
if
or.
you bring that, next time you get someone new, you might say,
Yeah.
hey, maybe I can, let me give you this brochure and just check out their website or
Yeah,
something like
because
that.
I could vote on a conflict or something and not even realize it was a conflict.
Yeah, and if you want those brochures as part of the city to give people as they onboard, I can get you some. DelDOT comes by and gets like 300 every few months or so. So if you want those to be able to give to your employees as a heads up of, hey, we should do this, I'd be happy to get them to you.
Thank you.
I think that's a great idea, thank you.
Now, my question is, if a council person's concerned that they may have a conflict, can they contact you directly, and how's the easiest way? To go to the website? Is there a way to email you, or?
No, you can email me directly, and let me get you a card.
And then my second question, would that apply to people that are appointed to committees as well? If they're on a planning and zoning committee and they're concerned that they may have a conflict, can they have access to you as well?
Yes. Anybody who works for the city, yeah. Oh, if you can make a little bit of an adjustment
Thank you.
on my card, it's at delaware.gov now, not at state.de.us, but I don't want to waste them.
Thank you.
I don't want to waste them.
Thank you.
So
It's
say
at
that again.
delaware.gov.
Thank you.
And I will email you back, I promise, the same day. I never let people wait overnight, because I know sometimes the questions are things that you're really worried about. I don't want you to stress, or have to go into a meeting knowing you have a question and I haven't gotten back to you yet. Okay?
All right, does anybody else have any questions from council?
Other than just a statement of thank you. That was very informative. I appreciate you
You're
coming
very
here tonight. Yeah.
You look exactly like my brother-in-law. Like, exactly. I can't stop looking at you.
That's,
Is that a good thing or?
that's scary. Conflict of interest.
Don't need to get out, don't need to recruit, step out.
Thank you for having me, I appreciate it.
Well, this is probably something we're gonna start doing more on a yearly basis. Certainly when we have new elected people, we certainly are, the county council has started this and certainly recommended it, so we wanna try to continue to do this. It gives us quite, a chance to ask questions and make sure we're all on top of it. Again, this is as much to protect the individual elected or those serving as it is the city, and none of us wanna make a misstep and have a conflict that ends up costing our town a lot of money. So
Can I just add one more thing?
sure.
One thing I wanted to point out is, if somebody, like, let's say you're doing a contract for somebody to do something, and let's say print out brochures, and Councilman Henderson owns a printing company, and he can do it for half the price. You still can't give it to him because of what that looks like to the public. So even saving money, there's a case out there that says you don't have to take the lowest bid if it creates a conflict. So I just wanted to add that too as well.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. If no one else has any questions or comments, I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
We have a motion. Is there a second?
A second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, okay, it's unanimous. We'll see you back here at 7 o'clock.